Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi, Dr. Pena. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, Todd. It's so great to meet you.
I'm excited for the interview today. I'm not only excited for season 7, which is just starting, but I've wanted to interview you for a while, and I kept getting tripped up on scheduling. It was either I was between segments of season 6. I think you had a hip operation, maybe,
Yes.
I think, and like we just couldn't make it work. Through your speakers bureau, but we finally did it. We're finally recording. I've actually interviewed a colleague of yours, Lucy Westlake, who is an incredible interview. I've had her on twice to talk about just her climbing and just the extraordinary things that she's done. I feel like I didn't do enough as a child after talking to her, The things that she did before she was ever old enough to drive is
Right.
just is crazy, right? But as I started to look into you, you're like, I mean, I don't think we have enough time in the episode to talk about all of your expeditions and all the cool things that you do. It's your environmental research, I think your climbing experiences. You've been on the top part of the earth, the bottom part of the earth. Like if it exists on the planet, you've probably been there. But let's get started. Just if you don't mind, just tell the listeners briefly a little bit about your background and your story, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Sure. So, my name is Ulyana Pena. So I grew up in a Ukrainian-American family, and my parents really believed in experiential learning. So I was already in the Swiss Alps at age 6, not climbing, but on one of those cog railways going up a mountain and just getting really exposed to the snow and ice and mountains from a very early age, which I think kind of really imprinted on me and led to my career path eventually. Because aside from the outdoors, my dad and I would work together on science fair projects. It was a great way to bond, and also just a great way to get experience in science. Like, is that really what I want to do? I mean, I'm always naturally asking questions, just curious about the world, and that's a way to formalize it. And then I feel like those early experiences also took me in my career path as a scientist. So there's this blending of the outdoors and the indoors that's made me kind of, I guess you could call it, climbing scientist, but who's also an educator. And so I've had the opportunity to mentor people like Lucy, and also work with students. At the University of Colorado, I work in a climate science center as head of communications. Really important to really
Yeah.
communicate the science to the public. And then at Colorado College, teaching young students about what's happening to our world.
Yeah, for sure. And you couldn't have picked a better state probably to be in, to just be able to
Oh,
on the weekend go pick something to climb or go see.
absolutely. I mean, you have just such a conglomerate of national labs here, universities, and then the mountains right at your disposal. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've spent significant amount of time in Colorado, but every time I always have a checklist of things I want to go to because you can see it's really the gateway to the West for one. I think people don't realize that when you get to Colorado, you're really kind of it's the beginning of heading west. So you see a
Mhm.
lot of varied terrain. There's desert there. There's mountains there. You can get snow almost all year long at some place. There's ghost towns. Like it's nuts how much stuff that there is, how diverse the terrain is.
Right.
It's really amazing. You could
There's
you could
something for
spend years
everyone.
there.
Hmm.
There's something for everyone there for sure. Let's talk about, so as a climber, you've climbed in, and I'm just going to kind of run down a little list here. I don't know if I'll even have them all. You've climbed in the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, the Cascades, and you've done. I think you've probably done a lot of this recreationally, but also to witness climate change. Can we talk about some of those expeditions? Like, what were your favorites? What were some of your biggest findings? What were your toughest ones?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so I started off climbing pretty late. It was actually in college that I really, like last year of college into graduate school already. And so one of my first highest peaks was Kilimanjaro, and just seeing this volcano, rising from the plains of Africa, and then climbing that, and then going and seeing ice in Africa, right? It's just this surreal experience. So that was just for fun. And then I realized, well, man, I really like I'm enjoying the physicalities of going up these mountains, and then also trying to understand, well, this is not what I saw in the books about what the glaciers should look like. For example, in Kilimanjaro, what's happening? A lot of them are disappearing. And so it was a chance to really get to places and explore and see how the mountains are changing firsthand, but with the scientific knowledge and that training that I had. And so it's dramatic, some of these changes, like just the Mexican volcanoes, again, a place you wouldn't think Mexico, volcanoes
Mm,
with glaciers.
yeah.
And so just up there watching those glaciers disappearing is pretty staggering. And then the pollution that comes from cities, and it comes from transportation and all the cars, a lot of that stuff can end up on snow and ice in the mountains. It can get lofted pretty far. So when I was working on a PhD in the Himalaya, I had a certain topic I was working on, looking at flooding of glaciers that were growing these lakes due to warming, but then also sampling some of the snow and saying, this is really dirty. What role does this play? Can this enhance melting? So it's really interesting. Like when you're out in the field, you kind of have one idea of what you might want to answer, but then a whole nother chapter can open up just by following your curiosity, and
Yeah.
really trying to, the
But
question kind of sometimes reveals itself to you. Yeah.
sure. Right, right. Um, 20 years ago, Al Gore made Inconvenient Truth, an
Hmm.
Inconvenient Truth. I'm assuming you probably have seen
Yes.
that. um, I thought it was an incredible documentary. I think, I admire his mission to inform people of things, but I think it's hard not to see Al Gore not politicize an issue like this, right?
Hmm.
But so much stuff that he talked about in that documentary has happened. Now,
Right.
20 years later, we can almost look back on it with a director's cut and say, wow, all this stuff really started to happen. I remember there were some really compelling scenes of like him being in Greenland next to a fissure in the ice and the water's flooding down into it. He's talking about how it lubricates between the ice layer and the rock layer, and this is how things break off and slide off and things like that. And it's insane because you're right. Like when I was in high school, I'm significantly older than you, but when I was in high school, we saw pictures and there were those glaciers, but then they only exist in the photos now.
Hmm.
None of that looks like that anymore. So I think I'm curious, what you talked about, like lakes that pool on the top of glaciers. Like,
Hmm.
tell the listeners who don't know, like what happens with that? Like, what's the danger of that pooling there? Why isn't it just refreezing? Where's that water going to go? Is that dangerous?
Yeah, no, this is a
Yeah.
great question. So this was in the Himalaya where I was really studying this in depth. And a lot of those glaciers are covered in debris, so rocks and dirt and dust that all have kind of covered that ice. So when you first arrive there, you might look like, where's the glacier? Because it just doesn't look like one, right? It doesn't look like that clean ice that we're used to in some of the maybe the polar regions. And so if that layer of debris is thick enough, it can actually insulate the ice, so protect it. But if it's thin enough, it actually enhances melting. It's like, so I'm wearing something dark, you're wearing something dark. We're going to absorb more of that, the heat from the sun,
Hmm.
just from the nature of that, the dark material. So the same thing on a glacier. If you have a lot of dark material, it'll absorb more of the heat of the sun and melt the ice faster.
Gotcha.
So in some pockets, like where you have kind of like dips, if you will, in the ice, you can kind of concentrate that heat, so it starts to carve out these small little puddles, and then they start to grow into ponds and lakes. And so essentially, you have this positive feedback going on. And so the surface can be riddled with these lakes, and because the water is going to absorb also more of the sun's warmth, it's going to rapidly cause more and more
Got ya.
melting. But the thing is, we notice it's not just on the surface that's pockmarked. The interior also, you can actually go into ice caves and try to see how all these things connect if they do. So it's fascinating. Like what you see on the surface is not all that's happening. There's a lot happening below.
Wow. And I know part of your research is about carbon that
Mhm.
lands on the ice and I think warms the ice more. And I want you to tell a little bit about that. I think Lucy told me on her last interview that she was collecting some ice samples or some snow samples for you. I think it was maybe K2 she was going up.
Yeah. That was a great collaboration. A colleague of mine said that Lucy had reached out to her for collecting black carbon. So these are these little particulates that can come. They can come from what's called incomplete combustion. So when you're basically burning fuel, not all of it burns off. Right? It's not super efficient, and so these little particles of soot or black carbon can get lofted in the air and get transported long distances, including to the mountains. And so, yeah, Lucy and I collaborated because she was going to these places and we have no data, no understanding of, well, do we even have pollution in this form of black carbon falling on these peaks? Is it even a concern? And it's that same reasoning that we talked about. If you're wearing a dark material, black carbon is dark, so it's going to absorb more of that solar radiation, and so it can enhance melting, but it's not as visible. It's not like the whole entire surface of a glacier is dark. What Lucy was finding is that when she was filtering it down to filter the size of a coin, even though the surface may have looked pristine, there's a lot of stuff present in that
Hmm.
snow. And so then we put that into a computer model and figure out, well, how much more melting does that cause?
That's interesting. Well, that is fascinating. So is all of that or, I mean, to the best of your speculation, I guess right now, is this all a man-made problem? Is this our pollution, or is this caused naturally by maybe volcanoes and things like
Great
that?
question. It's a mix. It's a mix.
Okay.
So there's black carbon that comes from industry, and then wildfires obviously produce a lot of soot that can
Oh
also
yeah.
end up, especially Greenland. Like Greenland gets a lot of the soot coming from wildfires. There's a way to distinguish them, and so you have to kind of look at um, the properties. You can look at it under microscopes. You can look at it through specific things called photometers that can actually tell you, well, how much of this is actually dust or volcanic ash versus pollution. So there's techniques to do that. Mhm.
That's interesting. You've also had some Arctic and Antarctic adventures. Can we talk about those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so where do we want to start?
Wherever. Like how, why? First off, I think what go to the coldest places on the earth. I can't imagine. you know,
I mean, honestly, it was
but
always a dream of mine, even though I cannot do well in the cold. It's like my cold tolerance is not that great, but I'm drawn to these places.
I
Um,
think one thing I didn't know, and I'm sorry to interrupt you there for a second, but like when Lucy was telling me about how long it took just to get to the bottom of Everest, like people are on these treks for weeks before they ever
mhm.
get to climb the mountain. It's nuts to me to even think about that. Is it the same when you go to the North Pole, the South Pole? Is it a long time to get to these places? What's just that part like? Where do you
Sure.
depart from, and how long does it take?
Yeah. So we can start in Antarctica because this past January I was able to go all along the western coast. So you start you fly down to Argentina, a city called Ushuaia. So there's a port there, and then you take a ship down to Antarctica. The ship I was on was a hybrid tourist scientist ship. It was a really cool model because it means I can do science on board and also talk with the tourists who are there to see Antarctica and tell them, well, this is the science we're doing, and you can even get involved and help and collect samples. So I think it's a great model. So basically, this hybrid ship is also using sustainable practices with liquefied natural gas, so it produces much less particulates. And I'm looking for these particulates, but I don't want them to come from the ship, of course, right? Because
Yeah.
then it skews the results. Um, so basically, I mention all those details because this ship is really fast and efficient. So sometimes it might take ships 2 days to sail down to the very tip of Antarctica, and we could do it in maybe a day and a half or less, just going faster. And then once you reach the tip of Antarctica, then you can follow the coast along. There's a bunch of different seas. You know, the whole thing's called the Southern Ocean, but it's split up into different segments. Our goal was the Ross Sea, and this is a marine protected area. So it's still relatively pristine, and that's what I was checking for as well. And then you can see these historic huts from the historic Antarctic explorers making their bids to go to the South Pole. You can visit those old huts and step back in time, like over 100 years. For me,
Wow.
that was fascinating. Like I love the science I'm doing. I love the scenery, the penguins, of course, but that to step foot into those huts, there was a mirror hanging on one of them, and I took a picture, of myself in that mirror, and I'm like, oh, how many people looked at themselves in this mirror like
Wow.
over 100 years ago, and they were going to the pole. So that kind of small connection there with history is very cool. Um, but that whole trip, so that was what's called a half circumnavigation. So we didn't go entirely around the continent, but just half. But that took 30 days.
Wow.
So yeah, so
Wow.
mhm.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Let me ask you this. You hear, I think the other day I just read a news story just a couple of days ago about um, an iceberg that had been, basically spinning in circles for 20 years and it's finally broken free of that and it's going to drift into warmer water and melt and people are worried about this. How much of what you see in the media is is really of concern, or is it just the media with scare tactics
Mhm.
like they do? Are the polls really something that we really, really, really need to worry about? I just heard this, and I'll also say this before I let
Mhm.
you answer. I just heard just a couple days ago that for the first time, uh, the northeastern Canada, like Halifax, Nova Scotia, all that area, didn't freeze this time of the year like it normally does. It's warm.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I'm actually heading there in February on an expedition to the ship that I'm talking about is an icebreaker, so it can get through these places, but I'm very curious about the status of the ice there and also pollution impacts because it comes from us here in North America. But let's start with the Arctic because that is a far more sensitive region as far as the melting. And Greenland, for example, has seen unprecedented melting. They, at the very top, like around 10,000 feet at what's called Summit Station, they were recording rain when it should be snowing. The importance of Greenland is this is land-based ice, right? So there's two kinds of ice we talk about. Sea ice is the ocean that freezes and thaws every year. This is a normal process. It doesn't cause sea level changes because that's just the ocean.
Right.
But the land-based ice coming from Greenland or Antarctica, once that starts to mobilize, that can cause massive sea level changes. Now, the scale of timing is for really massive melt is still, centuries away. But the thing is, we have increasing storm surge. So you have hurricanes, right, that can cause storm surges where that water kind of goes in further than it otherwise would, that sea level's impacting, right? Because even just a couple inches, as we've been seeing of rise in the last kind of decade or so, can mobilize more water further inland. Okay, so just because we don't have massive melt, like all this stuff coming out, doesn't mean it still isn't a problem. I think the media could do a better job of not
Hmm.
scaremongering with some of it, really to present the facts. Because if you want to trust science and the scientists, present the facts. A lot of them do circle back to the original sources of which research they took that from. You've probably heard of the Doomsday Glacier down in Antarctica. That's the Thwaites, and we actually
Hmm.
sailed past it. The reason that one's important, and so there's also one more thing to explain. There's something called ice shelves. So it's kind of like the barrier between the land and the sea ice. And so Antarctica has a lot of these ice shelves all around. It almost kind of acts like it keeps that land-based ice snug up against where it's supposed to be. And once you mobilize something like that iceberg you said that had broken off, you can mobilize that land-based ice into the ocean and causing a problem. So there's this very complex interplay of ice. And then the shelves help protect the coast from that land-based ice being broken up and ending up in the ocean. Now, again, we are talking about longer scales. Geologically speaking, that's nothing, right? I'm a geologist by training. So it's like, oh, a few centuries is like that, geologically speaking. But humanity does need to be doing things to mitigate and adapt already. That is, yes, an absolute, because we see it in motion. And in some cases, like there might be some accelerations and tipping points we reach sooner because of some factors that are feeding off others that we're still learning about. And the computer models are as good as the data we have. They're really good, but there's just a lot of these. I think it's better to err on the side of caution and be already preparing for these
Yeah.
changes.
Yeah. And just, I remember someone, you were talking about sea ice, and I remember someone showing me one time, ice in a glass of water, when it melts, the glass doesn't overflow,
Mhm.
but when it's on land and it will affect the sea level. So
Right.
just for the listeners who aren't clear, Antarctica, there is a landmass there that's covered in ice. Is
Huge
that right?
landmass.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then with the North Pole, that's just ice on top of ocean.
Well, so the Arctic is, yeah, mostly the sea ice, but then you also have the Arctic land masses like Greenland. Well, that's the biggest one, and
Gotcha.
that has land-based ice. Yeah,
Okay.
so
Gotcha. Gotcha.
in it's a very different scenario north and south. So in the north you
Mm.
have a lot more ocean. Now the problem is if you start melting that sea ice, it's going to reveal darker water below, right, which will absorb more heat, speeding up that process. So any of the sea ice that you may have buffering that land-based ice is melting away can also cause mobilization. So again, it's this complex interplay. But that demo you're talking about, I actually recently did on a TEDx talk at MIT about a month ago. And so I had a glass of water that already had ice in it, and the water level didn't change. And then I dumped a whole bunch into another glass to demonstrate, well, this is why we're worried about that land-based ice.
People talk, I think, from Al Gore's documentary, the time frame he was talking about in the documentary has accelerated since the
Mhm.
time he even made the documentary. I can't help but wonder, you talk about kind of the geology time frame, how slow it all really happens. But if Mother Earth really wanted to work quick, it could.
Oh yeah.
Everything is a huge system, really.
Mhm.
And where people think we might have 100 years before we lose Miami, it could be a lot less.
Right.
It seems I live in New York most of the year, and it's been crazy to see the arguing, just the politics of what's going on there to try and protect the lower part of Manhattan.
Right.
Because obviously Manhattan Island is it's gonna sea level rises. There's gonna be
Mhm.
serious consequences there. Same as
Oh,
Washington
absolutely.
D.C., same as Miami, a lot of places.
There's
But
a tool online you can actually use if you want to visualize it yourself through NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You can visualize these different rises. And I use that in my class to really show students, like, this is how far reaching that water can be.
yeah,
Absolutely. That visual is much more powerful.
yeah, yeah. And what's interesting in Manhattan is the people that just have bought expensive properties are fighting it because they now don't want seawalls, you know, ruining their views. So they're like striking down any kind of thing that they want to do to try and protect the island from being flooded, just because these rich landowners don't want to obscure views. They don't want they don't want a 20-foot seawall anywhere.
Yeah, it's just, I've seen instances of this down in Texas as well, where someone's like, well, I'm going to build my beachfront property even closer. And so walk past it, and it's now a condemned property because it flooded, and then the stilts that these homes are built on were just on the verge of collapse, and there were sandbags all over the place. And yeah, it's this denial really is just going to prolong that misery. It's like if we take action now, if we just even treat it from the economic perspective, we're going to save a lot more money by doing something now than down the pipeline when it's in the trillions of dollars
Yeah.
in damages.
And I think Washington D.C. has to be the first one to really set an example for that.
Mhm.
And I heard that they have done some things. They've moved parts of parks back and cherry trees and like they do uh, cosmetic
Mhm.
work to protect the stuff that's really low and flooding. But that's got to be the city that maybe takes a stand and says we're going to build a seawall because everything in DC is so low to sea level. Like it's how humiliating to have our capital flooded first.
Right.
you know?
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing, to your point there, like the construction of these is definitely necessary, but like the biggest thing that has to happen is cutting emissions of carbon dioxide. I mean,
Mhm.
that's our livelihood, that's our modern day conveniences. But really, like, all the models show, like, that's the only way, like, to really try to put an, it can't
Yeah.
stop it at this point, but at least slowing it down.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's people that listen to my podcast or know me know I'm a cup is half empty kind of guy sometimes. Well, I tell you, as much as I liked An Inconvenient Truth, and I've said this many times on this podcast, when it was over, I just felt like, wow, I really admire what Al Gore did here, but this problem almost seems impossible. Like
Yeah.
it seems like we can't throw enough money at it. We can't police the world enough to fix this. Because he talked about China and how many people in China would be getting cars, and
Mhm.
just that growth alone, and these countries that are industrializing that for the first time. What are we supposed to
Right.
do? Tell them not to? Like
No,
it's
no, see, that's
yeah,
that's that's the thing. It's like, "Oh, well, we have it, so you don't get it,"
yeah,
because we can't ruin the planet. It's like, well, we're the US is one of the biggest, like, contributors to this. But, there's a real surge to switch over to renewable energy. Some of my work, I also do a little bit of contract work to really understand, like, well, how's this clean energy transition going to look? And there's no future without it, basically. Like, we have to be doing it. We have to be doing it sooner.
Yeah.
electric vehicles as well. There's obviously issues with everything you can find, but the main thing is if we want to cut these emissions, that switchover has to happen. We cannot be doing business as usual. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I read a recent article even saying that, how we're trying to get down to below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. We're on track easily to be 3 and above. We are
Mm.
not making progress. And so
Yeah.
it really needs to be a paradigm shift. It really needs to be a cultural and societal shift in how we do things. Just and I teach my students this, like, yes, we have to really, corporations need to take responsibility, but we have power as people too by saying no to those corporations. We don't have to
Yeah.
give them business, right? We can mobilize as people and say, no, no, we're not
Right.
doing this. So,
Right. I wanted to have a sense of hope when the documentary was over. Instead, I felt kind of hopeless about it. And also, I was in elementary school in the 70s, and the big movement was ecology. That was the
mhm,
word. That was the buzzword. It was about ecology and recycling and solar. You started to see solar panels for the first time in the 70s. They're very expensive, but you were seeing them.
right.
And and then it just sort of died out. And then 20 years later, there's another buzzword, and it's going green or whatever, and it's just almost like something that every generation gets, but it's just almost kind of like a fad. Do your part, and then it just fades out, and people lose interest. And I
Yeah.
and I fear that's also part of it. And I don't know if there's a solution to that or
Well,
what,
social
but
inertia is a very big problem, absolutely. But like in some ways, people adapt to change pretty easily if they have to. Like for example, our grocery store finally said no more plastic just last year. It's surprising how long it took
yeah,
because they've been putting up signs saying we're going to do this for 4 or 5 years, and finally they did it. And there's so much anger about but people adjusted, right? People
yeah,
adjusted, and now it's paper bags and they bring their own. So I think it's very hard to change it, but I think it really does start with education, which is why I am in science education. I
yeah,
formally teach, at the university level, but I also love reaching out to younger students and adults, who may have no idea about like what any of this is what is the science saying? Can I trust it? Like misinformation in science, super important. How to critically think, super important. Beyond like just teaching facts about climate change, I really try to dive into that, a really understanding of the human psyche, why it behaves the way it does. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm
yeah,
saying like I have a very big interest in what role those social factors play also in this, because we can present all the facts in the world as we see, but it might not change any behavior
yeah,
until you show well what that will do personally. So.
yeah. Yeah, I went into a King Soopers and I didn't know about their bag policy. I was just visiting a friend of mine, and they're like, "Where's your bag?" And what? I
Just
had to
carry it
buy
on.
one of their bags. I'm just a tourist. Like I had to buy a bag. But New York had the bag policy, and they did away with it because COVID hit, and then they didn't want
Mm,
people bringing in bags that could be
mhm.
contaminated. And Starbucks did the same thing. They dropped their policy. Remember, they were going to do away with giving you cups.
Yeah.
They did away with that silently. By the way, no
Mhm.
one really. They never made an announcement about it,
Yeah.
that because they didn't want people handing possibly contaminated cups across the counter.
Yeah. I
So,
I trust you. I don't drink coffee and I don't go to Starbucks, so I don't know. Um,
what I mean, you can imagine the waste that they generate by giving
yeah.
just
Mhm. Totally.
temporary cups, but that was going to be their thing. You could bring your own mugs in or whatever, and they would fill them up. But after COVID, everybody changed their mind on that.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting because like, if we travel quite a bit, and I can also see, like, in Europe, for example, just how many strides have been made, I mean, for years now, when it comes to things like the reusable bags. How produce is even sold. Like here we have those little, plastic containers for all the berries, and there you can just scoop them. So I don't understand that incessant use of plastic. That's a whole other topic we
Yes.
can talk about as well.
I,
But then also just the culture there of riding bikes, so.
Yeah, yeah. A colleague of mine in Colorado, I go visit. He has a little bit, I believe, a business incubator company,
Mhm.
and he's helped incubate a lot of companies that have new types of wind power, and a lot of, I think,
Great.
some great technologies are coming out of there. But I have to say, and I want to ask you this because I mention this a lot. You know, you hear the push on. Right now, Colorado has more electric cars than California. They've finally surpassed California in electric vehicles. I have trouble thinking that electric vehicles will really catch on, that it will become as big as people think. And here's the reason why I think that this is the case. I think if the oil producing nations of the world really saw electric cars as a threat, they would lower the cost of barrels of oil. Because if they could have Americans pay $1 a gallon again, no one's going to buy an electric car.
Mhm.
Do you feel they hold the ultimate trump card and essentially are very powerful in a movement against kind of climate change and are how dangerous are those nations because they do control the oil, and
Oh,
oil is such an important commodity in everything. It's in fact it's part of our inflation problem right now. I believe
right.
if you could lower the cost of oil, you could lower the cost of how products get, everything has plastic in it, how products
Yeah.
get made, how things get shipped. Everyone orders their food for delivery and Amazon's delivering something like that. Could be a step in the right direction for I think just lowering inflation. But from an environmental perspective, how dangerous is the scenario I'm talking about?
Right. I mean, no, it would be a good idea for the reduction of inflation, but you have that whole, like you said, environmental component of it. I would imagine if it would temporarily be used as a tactic to get things down in a year, probably in the grand scheme of things, not going to do much damage. But we know that's not how the world works,
Yeah.
and that's probably not unlikely to happen. So it's
But
a
if
tough
people can
question. I
get their
don't have.
gas cheaper, if people can get their gas cheaper, why buy an electric car when you just look at economically how much it would cost to run that car? Because I don't think the power companies would match that, would they?
I'm not sure towards
Yeah,
that end. Yeah. But I know, like with so we purchased a hybrid, and we don't
yeah,
have the infrastructure, for the plug-in type. So it
sure.
saved us so much money on gas just in comparison, seeing how much you have to fill up, and we feel better, about it's less pollution. Because the thing is, we've already reached what's called peak oil, and it's becoming more expensive with production, and we're trying to do a lot more here in the U.S. as far as there's also fracking being done. Canada has tar sands, which are extremely polluting, and it's very hard to extract the
Mm,
oil from that for how much you spend. So really, we've kind of reached that peak point, and so it is time to be making a transition. Because the other point we haven't mentioned is when you put these gases in the atmosphere, it's not just carbon dioxide; it's also methane. They have what's called a residence time in the atmosphere, and so how long it spends up there before it cycles through in some other form. But for carbon dioxide, for example, we're talk about centuries. So if we stopped everything now, if we stopped all our emissions now, it would take a long time to manifest that change, which is what's really worrying, is we have this
right.
compounding effect. I don't know if you were following with after with COVID, how they saw the drop in emissions.
Oh yeah.
It was kind of barely a blip though, as far as like trying to reduce warming, which is again not that encouraging, but also encouraging depending on your perspective. Like you said, you're half cuppers,
Yeah.
but so you can be like, okay, well that did do something, and let's keep going there. Let's see how much we can do. But at the same time, you think of like, well, that did nothing, so why not just keep doing what we're doing? We know the answer
Yeah.
to that. Like it's going to change society. You're going to have climate refugees. Where are all these people going to go? You're going to have more intense storms, wildfires. That's coming down the pipeline. We know. So
Yeah.
it's in our best interest to really like. I mean, the phase out. It shouldn't just be, okay, we're switching completely to renewable either. That's not viable. That's not going to work. But we do have to phase out fossil fuels. We have to phase in more of the renewable. And with the new administration coming in, it's not going to happen. And so like people are now trying to struggling to like model like what does this actually look like even in 4 years, how much damage can that do? So,
Right. Right. Wow. Well, we'll pivot away from the doom and gloom part for a
yeah.
moment, and I mean, it makes for a good conversation, I think, to look at those perspectives. Your love for science goes way back. You mentioned at 12 you were competing in science fairs. Can we talk about young Dr. Pena for a moment? Like, what was it like for you growing up? Where did you grow up? Do you have a big family? Did you grow
Sure.
up
So,
spiritual, religious? Like, when did you first see your first mountain and want to climb it? Like,
yeah.
what generated the interest in you to go to this direction?
Yeah, so my parents took us to the Swiss Alps, to Europe actually for a month, a vacation. It was like in August, and so seeing snow in August, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic in the mountains. So that imprinted on me. I had like just the love for travel and experiencing other cultures from a very young age. With science, it started off with really simple projects. I think my first project, I think I was 10 actually. I got an interest in why is there so much junk mail coming through the mail? There's nothing ever coming for me. There's no mail. And so we started kind of like weighing like, well, how much junk mail would come in a week and what day was the um, when the most junk mail came, which turned out to be a Tuesday. So it kind
Hmm.
of stimulated this interest in like in science. And from there, then I'm like, well, I was eating cereal. And I'm like, well, I'm not full after eating the cereal. So did a whole nother project about is it worth the cost by crushing down the cereal, seeing how much volume you get for the amount of money you paid. And they're like,
Interesting.
oh, that's not worth it.
That's funny.
I'm not going to name any brands here,
Mhm.
but I'm just saying like you can do an experiment for yourself. So that was kind of my intro to science and science fairs. I even tested UV radiation coming through t-shirt materials. I don't think we knew much back then about like just how much UV could get through
Hmm.
those t-shirt materials. And then I went the astronomy route. I really love space and planets, and so I did a high school project on something called solar sails, which is a way to travel out in space without fuel. It's
Yeah.
using the sun and the photons. And so I had a great mentor throughout that process. I received scholarship money to go to college. And when I got to college, I'm like, I kind of came full circle. I came back to like, I'm really enjoying the earth science classes more than the astrophysics. I liked working in the observatory. I love, looking at the night sky, but it was turning more into that more as a hobby. And my interest really went towards earth sciences, being out in the field, and then eventually towards understanding the environment. The environment I love so much. How can I help protect it in whatever form I can do as a scientist, communicator, educator?
Right. Right. Circling back to the to mountain climbing for a moment, I want to ask you about this. It seems like mountain climbing has been a luxury destination for people now. Like you see long lines of climbers trying to get to the tops of mountains. And this used to be kind of like for the extreme adventurer. To
Mhm.
say you're going to go climb Everest, you were like
Right.
like a serious adventurer. And now people are climbing just to get a social media photo.
Mhm.
How are humans dangerous to this environment? Are we causing a major problem by doing this? Is this ridiculous, or is this opening up, hey, people that didn't get a chance to do this anymore, we made it safer, we made it easier for people to go see these things. Is it good or bad
Yeah.
in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's a matter of perspective too. I feel like the mountains for me, and I'm sure for many people, really just help connect with the planet and have an understanding and appreciation. It's the same for going to the Arctic or Antarctic, but we do want to minimize the impact when we go there. And so, sustainable practices, for example, trying not to. Um, it's called leave no trace principles. When you're on the peaks, collecting garbage. Now, the problem with Everest is that it's such an extreme environment, and at those high altitudes, that there can be a lot of this garbage and oxygen containers, tents left. But there've been. I'm happy to hear that there've been a lot of efforts through local Sherpa communities and the climbers to clean that up. All right, so it's like I don't think anyone should be withheld from that opportunity. I'm not. I don't consider myself. I'm not an elite climber. I would love to try for Everest someday and have the opportunity to do that. But I'm also respectful of mountains and pay my dues in the sense that I have become a mountaineer. I have climbed many peaks before attempting something bigger like that, like an apprenticeship, if you will. I do believe in that. I don't believe
Sure.
in just paying your way and getting an experience because that's being a tourist versus a traveler, right? And really experiencing a place.
Right, right. Right. I know Lucy told me in her last interview, she when she was doing K2, that was when they had the death on the mountain,
Hmm.
and it really bothered her. It really
Yeah.
bothered her, and she's there were a lot of stories written about it, just how kind of
Hmm.
disrespectful it was because people were literally stepping over a dead person to
Right.
move up the mountain, and it was frightening, and I also wonder where all these people get their money to get their social media photo. They
Yeah,
just
and the
have
thing
like
is,
spendable money laying around that we'll go do this weekend.
yeah, and it's like I I've seen that trend, it's just like do it for the gram, and it's like,
Hmm.
is this what's really motivating us? It's like fine, like put up a photo or share the experience, but have the right motivations in place, and where's the humanity also? We need to be taking care of each other when we're in the mountains. That's that camaraderie. That's just such a big component of climbing. We don't step over dead
Yeah.
bodies. We don't. That's the ethics of the mountaineering community. So
Right.
if you do have people who have money just coming in and doing that, it is disrespectful and shouldn't be tolerated because that's again the ethos of that community is so different. It's kind of like this is where we go to escape all that, right? To really just connect with each other and with the environment and the mountains.
Do you think that those countries that connect to Everest, do you think they are allowing more people in because they want the money? Is it an economic thing for those
Yeah,
countries, you
it
think? Like,
is.
all right, let's pack the mountain with Americans that have a ton of money.
Yeah, I mean, the fees for climbing for foreigners is at least 11,000 per climber, just to climb the mountain, regardless of what companies are charging. So it is a big revenue source. I'm not sure how many millions come from it, but I actually lived in Nepal on a Fulbright fellowship for almost a year, and so really had an opportunity to just really be in country, both in the cities, and as well as in the mountains. And it is a poor nation, so I understand absolutely. But there's ways that, how about this model? Instead of packing Everest, say before you can climb Everest, you need to climb at least three other peaks above a certain altitude, which will bring in more revenue from them as they try to people do that and then try Everest, so that
Yeah,
it's not a dangerous situation. So there are solutions to it, because you
yeah,
can't just be driven by money from the get go, which sometimes that happens. But if they really thought about it strategically, that could be one way to do it. You spread out um, the people on different mountains. You open up tourism to other sectors of the country as well.
yeah, yeah. You mentioned that you also have an interest in space,
Mhm.
space exploration. Let's talk about that. What was the NASA Hera project?
Oh yeah. So HERA stands for Human Exploration Research Analog, and so it's this habitat, like 650 square feet, and it's set up in a building on the Johnson Space Center campus at Houston. So NASA, that's in Houston. And a friend of mine, this was back in 2016, told me that, oh, NASA's looking for people with astronaut-like qualities to participate in this experiment. It's 30 days. You're locked in this habitat. And that's all we know. Like, we don't know what happens when you're in there. And I'm like, well, I wanted to be an astronaut. I actually applied that same year and made it to the interview stage of the astronaut program. But essentially, they simulated a mission to an asteroid. So they kind of compressed the 30 days. Um, and every day you had to do all sorts of different tasks, like astronauts would on a station. So they put me in charge. I was the youngest, and in charge of, there were four of us. And so it was a really interesting experience because I've explored the outdoors quite a bit, and so exploring inner space, like a 650 square foot habitat with three other strangers, was quite the challenge because you can't exit that. If there's any conflict there, you have to resolve it. I feel in some ways it prepared me for COVID because when
Mhm.
you're confined, you're like, okay, I know how to deal with this mentally. But yeah, NASA was essentially looking for the effects of stress and confinement and ability to make decisions. So everything was virtual reality. Obviously, didn't go to space, didn't even have the microgravity experience there. But still, just a really neat experience that I think in the end, they had like 20 different scientists with experiments that they were doing with us in this habitat.
Growing up, I had a fascination with space as well. I think I was a huge disappointment for my dad, who wanted a baseball player. I had a chemistry set and had the first computers and had every book there was on astronomy. I remember when this, kind of seeing the first Enterprise, the first space shuttle, watching live on TV as it took off from the
Mm,
747, like the first glide tests and all. I was around for
mhm.
all that stuff. Right, I was
Nice.
just amazed
What a
by the shuttle
time.
program,
Yeah.
because you saw stuff in like a James Bond movie like Moonraker and the shuttles, and we're bringing this stuff to life. Like
Right.
it was really great to live through that. But there was a point of time, late 70s through the early 80s, my National Geographic subscription, there was a point in time, and I think it's one of the most fascinating times that I remember as a young boy, was we had Skylab.
Mhm.
So we had that in space. We had, I think, National Geographic. I can't remember what they were called. They weren't called Sea Lab, but they had undersea bases where people could be housed, and we had the biodomes
Oh, yeah.
built.
Mhm.
So it was like lots of these types of things. It was just so futuristic. It was such a fun, like a 5 year period where
Right.
all that stuff was going on and seeing all that research. And it was just like, wow, we're explorers. Like that was the
Mhm.
feeling of it. And I don't feel that anymore so much. I do think SpaceX has changed that. I think whether you like Elon Musk or you hate him, he's delivering the science fiction we saw in real life. And I think that's always been a really interesting thing is I think people that have worked on technology have worked on it because they saw it in Star Trek The Next Generation. And you're like, let's figure out how to make the Bluetooth, let's make wireless like this, communicators and things like
Oh, it's
they
amazing.
they
The
had to see
technological
it.
innovations that have come.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what he's done, like landing rockets. Like it's who would have thought catching rockets? Like I mean, everything that he read about or saw, he's like, let's make it work. Why aren't we making it work? And he's really made NASA look like a bunch of buffoons at this point. I think really, it's sad to say, but he's delivered what we saw, and I think that's always like really inspiring for people. It inspires a generation. Ultimately, going in the Air Force and being an astronaut wasn't in the cards for me. It went a different direction, but I definitely had a big interest in it.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think like space opening up to more people, like the mountains, right? Like it's not it's I think that can also change a lot of perspectives. Many people getting that experience, that overview effect, something I would, someday hope to experience myself too, because it really shows you an appreciation for what we have, and then how fragile that environment is as well. And also just like you said, stimulating that innovation, creativity, that next kind of boon of creativity and technology is coming.
yeah,
So.
yeah. Tell me about the Science in the Wild initiative. Are you still doing this?
Yeah, so science
Hmm.
I'm trying to do it.
Yeah.
COVID really just put a damper on it, but Science in the Wild was basically participatory science expeditions. And so I would have like formal expeditions that people could sign up for and go on. But now it's kind of become more of a customized experience where people can reach out to me and create a custom experience in the mountains where you can have different levels of science you want to do. If you want to just learn about it, or if you can contribute or do research. So Lucy was basically an intern for Science in the Wild and has been helping with collecting the samples. We've been trying to formalize a more kind of bigger training program for people as well, so that we can collect a lot more data to really understand the impacts of pollution. And not only does that help like really far-reaching places, like understanding like how the Arctic and Antarctic are changing, but just even communities. It can be a community science project of like, well, how much pollution is falling on my snow? And obviously that stuff has to come from somewhere. So if it's in the air, it's an air quality problem. So there's tie-ins to communities that we're trying to do more so too, and educational campaigns. So my work these days is a lot more kind of writing, speaking, and training smaller groups of people who are interested in custom experiences. Because, well, honestly, like it's hard to fund, and a lot of funding has gotten cut grant-wise. So
Sure.
yeah, that's kind of
Right.
been the how do we still keep it going? So
Right. And can anyone get involved in this? Like if they go to your
yeah,
website, can they send you a message and say, what can I do?
definitely.
Okay, that's
Yeah, yeah.
great.
Anyone can reach out on there.
That's great. Well, this has been an exciting interview. Is there anything anything else you want to talk about? Any other stories you want to share? Because I feel
Oh,
like
there's
we've just
so many.
tip of the iceberg is a terrible
No,
example.
it applies here though. Well,
uh,
I want to maybe share one more story that was just
sure.
this recently happened in June, but I had an opportunity to go up to Greenland on that same ship. And we couldn't make it to this village. I really wanted to visit this village because I had actually visited that village 15 years prior on one of my first expeditions solo. So I was really excited to go there. We couldn't do it because the sea ice was just too thick. The ship couldn't get through. So instead, we had to take a different route. And so we're kind of sailing through the mist, and all of a sudden, someone's like, "Polar bear." So, oh, polar bear, where's a polar bear? And then this big mass kind of appeared out of the mist too. So it was apparently a whale carcass.
Mm,
And polar bears were coming from every direction for miles. The total count in the end was 68 polar bears. It was like watching a documentary, like a Planet Earth documentary, unfolding in front of you. So you have bears eating the whale carcass, bears fighting, cubs over here, cubs being chased by mom.
wow.
It's just so I mention this because it's one of those experiences of like the power of nature, the beauty of the things, the unexpected. So again, we weren't even looking for bears. We were just it just kind of happened. And so being open to like those kinds of experiences in life, being out in nature, connecting with the planet, I think can really help us as we really strive to like mitigate, the impacts of climate change, not only to us, but to the creatures that we share the planet with.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's incredible. That's like Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, which is a show I used to watch when I was a
Nice.
boy, if you remember that. Um, but that's what you would see. You would see things just like that. Like it
Mhm.
was like incredibly graphic to watch on regular television when you're
Right.
8 and 9 years old, but it was nature, and it was
It's
like it was
nature.
just something you knew you had to respect from that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so this has been a great interview. I hope you come back again and we can do this
I'd love
again
to.
on later in the season or on season 8, or maybe you and Lucy both on at the same time to tell
That'd be great.
stories, because I feel like there's so much more, and it is a cause that everyone in the world needs to address, and it's been a real challenge to think about ways to address it. And although I do approach things sometimes from
Right.
the cup is half empty point of view, I do it because I know I'm not the only one thinking that, right? So there has to be a way where we deliver a message that can counter that. There have
Right.
to be the right words in the right order that can be said that makes someone go, you know what? All right. Yeah, I get it, because that's
Yes.
what has to happen. We have to convince people, and there's too many, convince me's why I should
Right.
do this. And people won't listen if it's going to cost them money.
Right.
That's the
Yeah,
problem. No one
that's
wants to spend the
right.
extra money. Um,
Mhm.
but I do appreciate your time today. And can you tell everyone how they can find you out there on social media and the interwebs?
Sure, it's scienceinthewild.com and at Science in the Wild as well. Keep it
All
simple.
right. Perfect. Well, thanks for coming out, and let's talk soon.
Thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.
Metacortex Publishing hopes that you've enjoyed this presentation.
Please take a moment to listen to some other podcast offerings from Metacortex Publishing.
The Danceology podcast interviews the great masters of dance, the working professionals starring in today's most exciting shows, and the rising stars ready to amp up the craft. I'm your host, Edyta Stawenska from Dancing with the Stars. Join me as I dive into the world of dance, uncovering unique stories and the fascinating personalities of industry professionals on Danceology.
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Duplantis, a Catholic priest, martial artist, and host of the Karate Priest podcast. Have you ever wondered what the church teaches about different topics? Are you a martial arts enthusiast or just someone who wants to learn more about martial arts? I'd like to invite you to join me and many guests on my podcast as we cover topics of faith, everyday living, and martial arts on the Karate Priest podcast.
The No Earthly Explanation podcast investigates the things that are unexplainable, hosted by world-renowned investigative researcher Donald R. Schmidt and scientist Ellie Ringo. Follow them as they look for evidence for things that have no earthly explanation. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Every year, tennis players from around the world compete for excellence, triumphing against all odds to emerge the champions. I'm your host, Maddie Harrison. Join me as I get up close and personal with these dynamic individuals and find out what it takes to go for greatness. Let's go beyond the match.
Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective, through exhaustive research, and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.